The prairie had a way of telling the truth when people would not. The wind never lied. And that afternoon it screamed across the dry land like it was trying to tear secrets out of the soil itself. The sun hung high and cruel, baking the earth until even the shadows looked tired. In the middle of that endless yellow plain she hung trembling, bound tight with rough rope that burned her skin every time she breathed. Her bare feet dangled inches above the ground, toes curling instinctively as if the earth below might rise to save her if she reached hard enough. Her dress, once white, once meant for hope, was torn and stained with blood and dust, clinging to her like a memory she couldn't escape. Her hair fell wild around her face, tangled by fear and days without rest, and her eyes. Her eyes carried the look of someone who had already died once, and was being asked to do it again. "I'll give you everything," she cried, her voice cracking as if it had been broken too many times to fully mend. "Please, please don't let him come back." Silas Crow stood a few steps away, his boots planted firmly in the dirt, his shadow stretching long and dark toward her feet. He was a rancher, born and shaped by this land, his face carved by years of sun, wind, and decisions he never spoke about. In his right hand, he held a knife, sharp, clean, heavy with purpose. It wasn't the first time he'd held one with a life hanging in the balance, but it was the first time his hand hesitated. The men who sent him here had spoken plainly. No witnesses, no stories, no loose ends. They paid well for silence. Always had. Behind him, his horse stood restless, ears flicking back and forth as if it sensed the tension thickening the air. Further back, the old windmill creaked and turned, metal groaning with every slow rotation, watching the scene the same way it had watched everything else for decades, quietly, endlessly, without judgment. The ranch house sat far off in the distance, small and lonely, a place that had seen its share of hard nights and harder choices. This land knew cruelty, but even cruelty had its limits. Her name was Clara May, though few people used it anymore. Names lost their power after a while, after they were whispered in the dark by men who didn't care who you were, only what you could give. She was 19 years old, but her eyes looked much older. They looked like they'd seen rooms with locked doors, promises spoken with smiles, and pain delivered like it was owed. She had learned early that crying didn't always bring mercy, and silence didn't always bring safety. Still, she cried now, because when everything else was taken from you, hope became instinct. Silas studied her face carefully. He had been told she was a liar, that she was dangerous, that she was trying to destroy good men with wicked stories. He had been told she was ungrateful for the protection she'd been given. That word, protection, had tasted rotten in his mouth the moment he heard it. He had heard men use it before, usually right before someone disappeared. "Who is he?" Silas asked, his voice low, steady, almost gentle, as if gentleness might keep the moment from breaking apart. Her lips trembled. She shook her head slightly, just enough to say no without saying it out loud. Fear tightened around her like a second rope. "If I say his name," she whispered, "he'll kill me. And if I don't, you will." Silas felt something twist in his chest. He remembered another voice once, years ago, begging in much the same way. His sister, younger than Clara, strong-willed, stubborn, laughing even when times were hard. She had trusted the wrong men. He had trusted their words over her fear. They said she ran away. They said she fell. They said it was none of his business. And the river never gave her back. The knife in his hand suddenly felt heavier. Clara's knees buckled slightly as exhaustion washed over her. The rope dug into her ribs, stealing her breath. She cried again, louder this time, not caring who heard. "I don't want to die," she said. "I just want it to stop." The wind carried her words across the open land, over fences and dry grass, toward places where truth rarely reached. Silas looked around, half expecting riders to appear on the horizon. Men always came eventually. Men with authority, with papers, with money. Men who believed the world bent for them because it always had. "They said you'd do it," Clara went on, her voice shaking. "They said you were the kind of man who finishes things." Silas clenched his jaw. Maybe he had been. Maybe that was why they chose him. "They took me because my father owed them," she said, words spilling out now, unstoppable. "When he died, they said the debt didn't. They said I'd work it off. I tried to run. They caught me. I tried to scream. They locked me away. Every time I thought it was over, another door opened. Another man walked in. Another promise was made that it would be the last." Tears streamed down her face, cutting clean lines through the dust. I escaped last night, she whispered. I ran until my feet bled. I didn't know where else to go. Someone told me you were fair. Fair, the word landed like an accusation. Silas looked at the rope again. One cut. That was all it would take. One cut to end her life, or one cut to give it back to her. He knew exactly which direction the knife was supposed to go. The silver waiting for him back at the house could buy new cattle, new land, a safer future. Silence had always been profitable, but silence had a cost. He stepped closer. Clara flinched, bracing herself, eyes squeezing shut. Please, she whispered again. I'll give you everything. Silas stared at her for a long moment. The wind howling between them, the sky vast and uncaring above. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with something that surprised even him. You shouldn't have to give anything to be allowed to live. Her eyes opened slowly, disbelief flickering. Across her face like a fragile flame, somewhere in the distance, a horse's whinny echoed, too far to be sure, too close to ignore. Silas knew time was running out. Whatever choice he made next would follow him for the rest of his life, and likely end it sooner than planned. The windmill creaked again, turning, as if urging him forward. Silas raised the knife, and for the first time in many years, he chose not the easier path, but the right one. The blade flashed once in the sunlight, and then the rope gave way, fibers snapping with a sound that felt louder than a gunshot in the open prairie, and Clara's body dropped hard into Silas's arms. Her weight real, living, shaking, as she gasped for air like someone surfacing from deep water, her fingers clutching at his shirt not in trust but instinct, because survival had taught her that if you let go too soon, the ground could disappear again without warning. Silas steadied her, cut the remaining bonds from her wrists, and in that moment he knew the price of his decision had already begun to collect. Somewhere out there men were riding. Men who did not forgive disobedience. Men who believed fear was a currency they could spend forever. Silas lifted Clara onto his horse, wrapped his coat around her shoulders, and turned not toward escape but toward the town, because hiding the truth was what had fed the darkness for years, and he was done feeding it. The ride felt longer than it was, every hoofbeat echoing like a countdown, Clara swaying weakly behind him, her head resting against his back, as if his spine were the last solid thing left in her world. When the town finally came into view, quiet and sun-washed and pretending innocence the way towns always did, Silas felt the weight of every eye before they even dismounted, because word traveled faster than horses in places like this, and secrets had a way of announcing themselves before anyone spoke. They brought her into the sheriff's office first, but it didn't stay private for long. By the time Clara stood on her own feet, wrapped in borrowed cloth, hands still trembling, the room was full, merchants, ranchers, churchmen, wives who sensed something terrible before they understood it. And at the back of the room, faces that went stiff with recognition the moment she lifted her eyes. Silas stood beside her, silent, solid, daring anyone to take her away again. The sheriff tried to speak, tried to slow things down, tried to turn it into procedure. But Clara's voice cut through the room before he could finish. Raw and shaking and unstoppable, she told them everything, not neatly, not politely. She spoke the way people do when they've been silenced too long, when pain spills out tangled and burning and alive. She named the rooms, the locks, the promises that were never kept. She named the men, ranch owners, a banker, a preacher whose sermons were loud and whose hands were not clean. Each name landed like a stone thrown through glass, and with everyone, the room shifted, disbelief cracking into anger, denial rotting into fear. They called her a liar. They said she was confused. They said grief made people imagine things. But then another girl stepped forward, younger, quieter, her voice barely held. But it held. Then another. And another. Stories lined up like ghosts finally allowed to speak. And the lie that had protected powerful. Men for years collapsed under the weight of truth too heavy to carry anymore. Outside, a crowd gathered. Inside, the sheriff's hands shook. He had known just enough to look away, just enough to survive, and now survival demanded a different kind of courage. By nightfall, warrants were written. Doors were kicked in, and men who had believed themselves untouchable were dragged into the same light they had avoided their entire lives. Some tried to run. Some begged. Some cursed Clara's name as if she had ruined them rather than exposed what they had done. Silas watched it all with a stillness that came from long overdue reckoning. He did not celebrate. Justice born late still carried bodies with it. The town changed after that night, but change never comes without cost. Silas lost his ranch within months, the bank eager to reclaim land from a man now labeled Trouble. Friends crossed the street to avoid him. Others tipped their hats in quiet respect but never stopped walking. Clara left town at dawn 1 week later, standing taller than when she arrived, scars still fresh but no longer hidden, carrying nothing but a small bag and something far more valuable, a future not owned by fear. Before she left, she looked at Silas and said, "You believed me when it mattered." He nodded once, because words felt unnecessary. Years passed. The windmill still turned. The prairie still remembered. And travelers sometimes asked about the rancher who chose truth over silver, about the girl who broke a town's silence, about the day fear lost its grip. Silas would look out across the land, eyes narrowed against the sun, and say, "Evil doesn't need monsters. It just needs people willing to look away. And all it takes to stop it is one person who doesn't." And that is why these stories must be told, because somewhere right now, someone is whispering the same words Clara once did, praying someone will listen. If this story moved you, if you believe truth deserves a voice and courage deserves to be remembered, subscribe to this channel. These are not just stories of the Wild West, they are reminders of what happens when silence breaks, when fear loses, and when one choice changes everything. Subscribe and keep these stories alive.